Hello everybody, and welcome to lecture 3.4 of our social psychology class. So we're getting close to putting module 3 behind us. One more after this. This is an idea I've been floating for quite a while. Obviously you've read the chapter. I hope you've read the chapter on competition and cooperation. And it's funny because I'm a teacher. I'll be next year. This is my 19th year of teaching. Let's look at it that way, and that's the longest I've ever done anything in my life. Second closest to that was my 7 years at the paper mill, but even there I had like 3 or 4 different jobs. It's natural for me to move on after a period of time, and in a couple of years I'll retire from teaching, and I've kind of envisioned that at that point in time I'm going to sit down and start writing and maybe write a couple books. And I don't really give a shit if they sell or not. That's not the issue, but there are certain things that I think I want to say, and I think books will be the format to do that. This will be one of the books. I'm starting to question over the last 5 years the utility of competition. And perhaps are there more negative outcomes as a result of competition than positive? So I would ask you to kind of treat this with an open mind, because I know competition, there's been a narrative built around competition about how beneficial it is. I'm going to toss it out there. I'm going to toss an alternate point of view and see what you think about it. I'm trying these ideas out. And obviously when we talk about competition as producing serious outcomes, right off the bat, I want to question that assumption. I want to question that narrative that supports our continued use of competition in the business world. People spend their Saturdays, Sundays watching other people compete. People compete with each other in various sports. Is this true? And does competition lead to the best performance? And that's an assumption, right? Does competition then separate the men from the boys, if you will? Excuse the gendered nature of that comment. But is it a case where the best win or always win? And often people who are engaged in competition, especially let's put it on an international or a geopolitical level, that life is a zero-sum game. That if my fishing fleet or my lobstering boats go out, there's only so many lobsters, and I want to take the lobsters so that other country doesn't get the lobsters or what have you. But and then people, when question about competition, they say, well, it's natural, survival of the fittest, which Darwin never said. He said survival of the most adaptable, which is very different than survival of the fittest, right? But we might point to the idea that competition is in my nature. It's natural. I'm driven by my DNA. And if that's the case, I'm at the point now that we're learning so much about DNA. Should we be driven by our DNA, or are we in a position to begin to understand how our DNA affects us and then maybe rise above our DNA, right? Is that part of the human quest or the human mission? I don't know, but it's generating a lot of questions. Some examples of the benefits, and notice I got that in quotes, of competition. One of the most important things is to the media, to the news media, is they want to be first and they want to be exclusive. And this is competing then with other news outlets, right? So news media, I want to be first. But notice, people don't necessarily hold accuracy up as the competitive domain. They hold up speed of reporting, and that is, speed is not necessarily conducive to accurate reporting. So is it a benefit to have a competitive news media where everyone's trying to outsource everyone else as quickly as possible? Does it lead to a greater level of inaccuracy, which we might then consider a downside of competition in the news media? Okay? And then we have this competition over what's news and what isn't, and what's fake and what's real, right? So news shows ratings are all important, and do some then networks emphasize a narrative over what is accurate or real? And the term fake news, a strange term, coming up over the last couple of years. Or alternative facts, like now facts are in competition. And here's a fact, but now we have an alternative fact, right? And is that even possible? Who knows? And right, not to get judgmental or political about that. Let's take another look. The drug companies in the United States are in competition. competition, right? They're competing for the almighty dollar. They want to bring drugs to market, and they do so to maximize the profit in this country, right? But notice that the drug company competition facilitates a lack of access to needed medicines in some cases. And I don't know that that's a benefit of competition. Seems to me like that's a downside, especially if drug companies are there to serve the person who needs the drug, or are they there to serve the needs of the shareholder in the company? And that becomes interesting. But the competition within the drug industry often then diminishes our ability to get the drugs we need, right? Look at the NFL. And I mean, when you think competition, football's, kind of the poster child of competition. What do we see? Well, the NFL concealed knowledge of head injury data and tries to discredit those doctors that conduct the research and report their findings. That is, for the pleasure of us viewing competition, we have people who are suffering permanent brain damage as a result of it. Now, maybe we're okay with that. That's a judgment issue. I'm not going there. But what I'm saying is the competition has led the NFL to attempt to discredit people who are voicing a concern about traumatic brain injury. And we can take that to our own campus. To what extent are people maybe suffering permanent disability as a result of competing in football or other contact sports, right? And it's not true of all sports. Congress seems unable to discharge its duties, that is, to effectively pass laws to serve the people, that represent the desires, needs of the constituents, because they're too busy competing with each other. So Congress has devolved into right versus left, and virtually nothing gets done as a result of this. Their competition now outweighs, it appears, their duty to serve the public in some kind of mutually beneficial way. They can't find any common ground. And doesn't that kind of surprise you that there's no common ground possible? I don't necessarily believe that. So I think that competition's benefits are somewhat oversold, and sometimes the downside to competition isn't even entertained as a thought, right? So I want to bring up this term schematic, and this derives from schema. And to what extent do I hold a schema that's supported, let's say, by a narrative, that out of competition emerges the best work, right? So if I believe that and I strongly adhere to that narrative, then I begin to become schematic for competition, and that's the word. So I start to see the world in terms of a rich competition schema. So when I view my world, then I see an opportunity. It's an opportunity to compete, maybe, rather than cooperate. And so I become schematic for competition. So I notice certain stimuli that might provide competitive domains in which to participate. Schematic means I process weight information differently. So when I look at the results of competition, I might see it as more beneficial, where someone who's not schematic for competition might see the results of competition as less beneficial. So schematic kind of prepares the way that we look at the world. Electrons visiting us right now. So, and it helps us remember or forget certain stimuli or information. That is, we tend to remember things that are consistent with our life schema and narratives, and we tend to forget information that isn't so consistent. Okay? So schemas are typically developed outside of conscious awareness. If you've studied any developmental psychologists, especially child development, then you're probably pretty well up on Piaget and his cognitive approach to the understanding of schemas and how they develop in children. It's something that happens. Remember, schema is essentially a category. So everything we've talked about in categorization largely applies to schemas, and they guide our processing of stimuli, often non-consciously, as category contents would. So, when one's schematic for competition, then one views better solutions as deriving from competitive behaviors and tendencies. If one is schematic for cooperation, then they believe that better outcomes will be achieved through cooperation rather than competition. So it really is kind of a core way of being in the world, of the way we view the world, are these schemas. So, for someone who's schematic in competition, then what do we know? Competition becomes a primary way to generate the best solution. If you want to create the best solution, what you do then is you create this team and you create this team and you put them in competition, and out of their competition emerges the best solution. That would be someone who's schematic for competition. The world then is viewed as a challenge between us and them, or Team A and Team B, right? Where winning is preferred to losing. And to me, one of the downsides to competition, because I'm a very competitive person, at least I used to be until I started questioning that competitiveness in myself, is when I win, that means for me to win requires somebody else to lose. And think about it. Let's do the ultimate kind of empathy exercise here. Why do I want to make people feel bad about themselves? That is, why do I want to create a situation in which people lose? And then they lose and they feel bad. Is that something I want, right? And I mean, a lot of people are like, yeah, I'm okay. There's got to be winners and there's got to be losers, and the losers got to learn to suck it up, and that's just all part of life. And we can advance that narrative and we can talk about that way. But a lot of what I'm talking about in this course is critical thinking, that is questioning the narratives under which we live. Bring those narratives up into consciousness and say, what are the consequences of this narrative? And I did a lot of winning, and that meant a lot of people did a lot of losing. And I'm not necessarily sure that I'm that I'm still happy about making people lose. Again, your mileage may vary, and that's kind of an individual idea. So, sources of competition, and let's tie this to some social psychological ideas here. Social identity theory. We've talked about it. We gain self-esteem through our group membership, so we split the world into the in-group, the out-group, and the greater the difference between the in-group and the out-group, the more self-esteem I gain as a result of it. And to the extent that my in-group beats the out-group, that is successful in competition, again, self-esteem is generated as this. So we maximize the gain by increasing the distance. And you saw the Tajfel work, as it talked about in your text, when teams were allowed to award points, it wasn't that I maximized my number of points. That's not important, right? 19 points and 17 points, that might be one option I could choose, but I might prefer to choose 13 points and 1 point. Notice, because the second choice maximizes the difference and indicates I really beat the shit out of those people. Right? So that's kind of something that derives from social identity theory, viewing the world as a competition between us and them. Right? So we derogate and discriminate against out-group members. We show in-group favoritism. Let me ask you this, Buckeyes. Is Ann Arbor really a whore? I know we're fond of saying that, right? Notice that we've carved out this rival in Michigan because we don't have a rival that's worth competing with in Ohio. No offense to the other schools in Ohio, right? So there is a way out of this with social identity theory, though, and we see in the Robbers Caves experiment, etc., the cross-cutting identities, right? We were in horrible competition with the Soviet Union, but when World War II came along and we're now going to fight the Nazis, right? That is, the Soviets and the Americans, the British are all going to join together, and we're no longer Soviets necessarily, Soviets first or British first or Americans first. We're allies first against the Axis. So we upped everyone's identity level and made a more global identity for each group that was in competition. And that's what you call a superordinate identity. Now, in the Robber Cave experiment with Sharif, what do we know? Conflict is a result of perceived limits on a desired resource. So we see ourselves in competition because there's only so much of the pie. There's a pie, and we're entitled to this aspect of the pie, and anyone who tries to take it from us better watch out. The in-group is then viewed as being more deserving of that resource, right? And we see fishing disputes around territorial waters. Why the heck do the Chinese or the Japanese get to fish off the American coast and take our fish away from us, right? So that can create a competition. And it's a realistic conflict because if we believe there's only so much fish, which is obviously true, then we're in competition for those fish for our own, right? So competition rather than cooperation is the result. And think about how difficult it is to get a group of nations together and say, look, this is what we perceive to be the amount of fish. What is a reasonable cooperative way of distributing those fish between our groups? That would demonstrate cooperation rather than competition. Notice when we look at climate change and we look at carbon sequestration, etc. Hey, we get worried because, well, if we reduce our carbon output, then other countries who don't reduce their carbon output might have an advantage over us. So it can be approached as a competitive problem, and we never see a solution to it. Whereas if we kind of approached it as a cooperative problem, hey, this is the planet that we share as human beings, notice superordinate identity, human beings, rather than Americans or Soviets or Japanese, then we might come to cooperative rather than competitive solutions. So notice that this is played out in competitive games that were taught since the beginning of time. There's only so much money in the Monopoly game, right? And the idea is to accumulate all the money or bankrupt the other players. So there's a way out of this. We can develop superordinate goals. We're in this, the planet we share. We need to work for the good of the planet, not for the good of my position, of my nation on this planet, right? Now, what are some competition outcomes? And here's where I'm going to start to try and chip away at the ideas. Competition increases self-esteem and self-efficacy. When we win, or perhaps to a lesser extent, we turn in what we believe to a good performance. But the downside is, when we engage in competition, we need to divide the world into us and them. That is, we have to have competing teams, right? What do we know? It operates as a surrogate to real competition. Consider this. I don't have to turn in my best performance to win. I just have to beat the other guy. I just have to do better than the other team. So competition doesn't necessarily lead to me generating my best performance. Just simply, I turn in a performance that at the end of the day is better than the other group. So I think that's one important fallacy, that competition causes us to turn in our best performance. Not necessarily. Just a better performance than the other guy. Right? So then it could operate as a surrogate to real accomplishment. Competition often encourages secrecy. That is, we hide the manner in which we're going to play, and that way we're not operating in a transparent manner. When we look at Congress, this is devastating. When we look at the administration, when we look at people having information that's important, but concealing that information because they don't want the other side to have access to that information, this can cause real problems, right? It encourages cheating. That is, if it's about winning first and foremost, then cheating is one way to get there. And we see that many people, in fact, cheat to win above and beyond just increasing their performance. It emphasizes advertising. So if we have a couple different products, right, what do? We're going to compete. I want to sell more than you sell. So I'm going to use advertising to attempt to persuade people to buy my product. And it diminishes creativity. We see this especially in Hollywood. My mom was a casting director since the early 60s. And back in the day, you see a lot of creative forces and creative people in Hollywood. That's diminished to a great extent as the media has become corporatized. That is, media doesn't want to take chances on creative ideas that may fail. They're competing, so they stick with the tried and true. And this is why we're deluged with more and more remakes, more and more reality TV that doesn't really kind of exploit creativity, but kind of just refurbishes what's been done in the past. It's safer, and we're more likely to be successful in competing for media dollars at that point. Okay? And note, again, we're talking in large part, in my opinion, the basis of some future book, which I will find the evidence to support. I have some evidence now. So advertising, competing for your dollars, competing for your votes if it's a political advertisement, this shit is costly. Advertising is expensive. There's people making huge amounts of money over advertising, and notice that it's often deceitful and manipulative. Advertising tends to damage self-esteem, especially any personal appearance type advertising. So hair care, face care, makeup, dietary stuff, it says basically operates on the premise you suck as you are now, but if you spend money on this product, you'll suck less, or you'll actually become bitchin'. All right, and that's kind of a cruel thing to do, especially to your customer. You got to make them feel bad so they buy your product, and then they'll feel better. Whoa. We got some craziness going on here. I better check the focus because the cats have gone berserk here. So hang on, I'm still with you. But it's playtime for the cats. Yeah, they knocked it out of focus slightly. So let's get a little better there. There we go. All right, thank you for that, Proton. They'd be nasty little creatures, right? So, and then politics are divisive. Look at this other group, they're wrong, and we're going to promote how wrong they are and how right we are. And it's wasteful. Let's face it, all the money that's being spent on advertising could be spent on product development and product improvement. But it's not, it's spent on advertising, right? And it wastes time. We, instead of getting information, we're getting advertisements, people trying to tell us what to do or what to buy. And ultimately, I think people often forget this, that advertising isn't free, it's expensive, and you pay. So when you purchase the product, consider the irony. You're paying for the advertising that was used to sell you that product. So you're paying to be persuaded. You are, and that seems kind of weird. So competition then, the fallacy and the hidden agenda, fallacy of learning to be a good loser. So we're taught since the time we're children, hey, you got to learn how to be a good loser. Well, maybe we shouldn't be in a situation where we have to feel like a loser in the first place. And we then are subjected to accepting diminished sense of self-efficacy and perhaps having our self-esteem damaged. Now, as far as physical competition like boxing, whatever, we talk about the fallacy of catharsis. That is that if we watch people cave each other's skulls in, if we watch people aggress towards each other, even in these controlled situations, it releases our aggression. Well, the research points out just the opposite, that the more aggression we watch, the more it primes us to be aggressive. So there is no cathartic effect. This is skinny, by the way. Let's put that out of our mind as thoroughly debunked. Okay? So, hidden agenda. Well, competition, is it racist or classist? That is don't offer real opportunity. That is, when we look at African Americans in the United States, maybe they're not afforded the same opportunities. Medical school might be a little harder, law school might be a little harder, but maybe it makes us feel a little better because we see the descendants of the African American in sports. So at least you can come and you can play sports and you can